I promise to work collaboratively, to listen to community members, and bring folks to the table who may not even be aware there is a table.
Those the words of new Seattle Department of Transportation Chief Greg Spotts as he was sworn in last fall. This week, he's coming to the table with the Seattle City Council to discuss how to implement the Vision Zero plan the city has to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries by the year 2030. Some big news there. Also, an update on how our region is working to reduce waste and improve recycling, plus possibly making major manufacturers responsible for at least a part of that. And also some chilling news from Seattle Public Schools and other major districts in our region talking about layoffs and shutting schools down. A lot to discuss here. We are discussing these stories and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine, all mine. And joining me is David Coleman of the Seattle Times. And David, I noticed another recent parenting tweet from you here, maybe more of a question about, okay, we did this, and then this happened with our kid, but is what we did the actual reason that happened? I'm very glad you're running into this early, because this whole concept of applying logic to parenting is a slippery slope at best. What's going on, man?
Oh, nothing specific, but you just started, you try so many things, and then eventually something changes and you have no idea which of the many things you did made a difference. And maybe it was none of them. Maybe it was just he decided he wanted to change.
That's the good stuff, man. Well, I encourage you to keep on that track. And when you figure out something there with that causal link, please let me know. I would love to figure that one out. I know other parents would too. Thank you, David. Thanks also to City Grinds Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Talk to John, get your latte on right there. They're on the first floor of Seattle City Hall. Thank you also to our patrons too. The Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign is underway. I'm showing off one of these beauties right now. We're hoping to get more listeners supporting the show at just $5 a month. At that rate, we will send you your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Send us your inventive photos with your SNVB sticker. We'll feature them right here on the show. To all of our existing patrons, thank you for your patience. I will be sending these stickers your way soon. Thanks finally to Converge Media, our partner for the video version of the podcast. Check it out on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get rolling with right here, right now. To begin with, David, we touched on the top to bottom Vision Zero review that SDOT reported on last week, and now they're talking about this in front of the City Council. And quick review, folks, Vision Zero in Seattle aims to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries by the year 2030. We currently have about 10,000 crashes per year, an average of 28 deaths, 180 people seriously hurt. That's lower than some of the other cities around the U.S., but still, of course, a major concern. David, in bringing this plan out for public review this week, I'm seeing several recommendations, including these things we've talked about: limiting right turns on red, implementing that leading pedestrian interval so pedestrians get a head start when the lights change there, focusing on Martin Luther King Way South specifically, and also some automated enforcement like speed cameras. Is this the right list of recommendations, I guess, is my question. Is there something missing here? What's your take on how the public is going to react to the council taking on Vision Zero this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's with Vision Zero and with traffic crashes in general, there's sort of always this balance between changing driver behavior and to a certain extent changing pedestrian and bicycle behavior, although lesser, of course, and then kind of balancing that with changing infrastructure in the system so that driver behavior doesn't matter quite as much, because if they make a mistake, then the system is built so that it's not going to lead to a deadly crash. And so, I think when we talk about things like leading pedestrian intervals and right turns on red, or automated traffic enforcement cameras, those are all sort of intended to change individual behavior. And, some of them work and have promising results. And, I think in particular, automated enforcement has shown to reduce speeds in certain places, but it isn't sort of those larger scale changes around, rebuilding roads or taking lanes away or things like that. And so I think that's going to be the kind of push and pull and balance we'll see in City Council and City Hall going forward.
I think so too. And this whole public outreach part of it, David, is interesting to me because in his remarks when he first took the job, Greg Spotts was talking about, okay, it's not just about bringing people to the table. it's bringing people in who don't even know that there is a table to have this kind of discussion. So what I'm reading there is reaching out to different communities who might not speak English all that well, people of different cultures, and trying to explain, okay, we're talking about reimagining this road here. We're talking about potentially helping out pedestrians here. We're talking about potentially putting in these red light cameras in your area, and you need to know this is happening so you don't get a ticket. Help me out with that part, because I think that public input piece, at least from what Greg Spots has said over the past couple of months here, is a very important part of this discussion.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to when Bruce Harrell was first elected. He,
Hmm.
uh, said pretty early on that he wanted more input, community input, specifically from certain communities
Yeah.
in South Seattle, and I think that was a good part of the reason why he fired Sam Zimbabwe, is because he wanted
Hmm.
to kind of hit the reset button on this.
Yeah.
And so, Greg Spots is, on the one hand, his own person and running his own department. On the other hand, he is Bruce Harrell's appointee, and so is going to
Yeah.
sort of execute on that. And so, yeah, I think we'll probably see a lot more, town hall feedback, surveys, that sort of thing around this.
Yeah.
That's always tricky because, banning rights on red is not popular. It's not going to be
No.
like, you're a driver and you're used to driving home from work, and this one intersection goes a lot faster because everyone's turning right on red, and then suddenly you can't do that anymore.
Right.
That's going to frustrate people. And so the balance with, traffic safety, but I would say a lot of policy in City Hall generally is how much public input, because there's certain things that are just necessary for City Hall to do that aren't always popular with the public. So how much
Yeah.
do you take that
Yeah.
into account versus how much do you just kind of do the thing that you feel like as policymakers it's your job to do?
And you're going down a path I'd like to briefly touch on to wrap up this topic here, David, just how Vision Zero could potentially get politicized in a few different ways here, because I feel like this is going to turn into a political football pretty quickly for council members, especially ones running for reelection here. I think about Tammy Morales. She's been a very vocal critic when it comes to traffic safety in her district, D2, and it looks like a lot of different projects for Vision Zero are going to be focused in that area. So, hey, look what I brought to the table here. Look what I'm bringing. And I just wonder about this, how this rollout could get politicized with different council members running in different districts.
Yeah, I often tell people that because I used to write more about politics before I started writing about transportation. And I tell
Yeah.
people that when I made that switch, I expected that the temperature on the beat might cool down a little bit. But in fact, transportation is, uh, people get very heated about transportation. People
Yeah.
probably get more heated about transportation and changes to the system than politics, I would say. And so,
Yeah.
and I think it's because it's something that people see every day.
Yeah.
Politics can be a little hypothetical or theoretical at some points, but if a change has been made to your road, uh, people feel that, people
Hmm.
experience that every day, and so they tend to care a lot more about it. Um,
Yeah.
so I think we'll see. You mentioned Tammy Morales. She has really, in recent years, this has kind of become her issue in a way that I think it wasn't
Hmm.
really for her first couple of years in office, around traffic safety, and specifically traffic safety in her district, because that's where most of the deaths happen.
Yeah.
Um, there has always been pushback. There are some bike lanes that were added in certain parts of South Seattle that, some residents around there really don't like and are really unhappy with.
Hmm.
So you're right, it is going to be political, and these are the sort of issues uh, that can bring out people's passions, we'll call them.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great observation here, and we'll see how that does play it out over the next couple of months here as we get into election mode. And it turns out we have plenty of zeros to talk about this. The council's Public Utilities Committee also talking about zero waste, an interesting conversation that actually has some interaction with some legislation in Olympia too. We always talk about recycling rates as a measure of success, but SPU this week is talking about rethinking that metric, and it's in large part because our recycling efforts have kind of stalled out. Seattle's done a very good job on recycling. We've had this goal of 70% recycling for some time, but we never have gotten higher than about 60% in 2016. David, this is a little bit of a mind bender for folks, but chasing after that goal of more recycling is actually getting a lot more expensive and the returns aren't that great either. This is a real quandary here.
Yes, this is this is kind of new territory for me. I don't,
Yeah.
I, I think, yeah, public utilities. That's always a balance between how much do you charge people
Yeah.
for service, and we're seeing the same thing in City Light, that there's kind of some pressures to raise rates, but of course you don't want to raise rates too high. How much are people willing to pay more to achieve sort of goals around
Right.
waste reduction and climate change to
Yeah.
a certain extent? That is, I don't know that there are very few people in Seattle that don't see climate change and waste reduction as important things, and yet those principles are often tested when you suddenly have to pay a lot more every month to achieve some of those goals. So this is it's tricky, and I think this is sort of indicative of a very Seattle issue of kind of weighing sort of ideology versus kind of the practical day-to-day, that sometimes that ideology is expensive to implement.
Agreed. And I just wanted to bring up, David, thank you for wrestling with this, because this is very complex. As a matter of fact, I was keeping an eye on this last week. The state legislature is looking at this. I covered this on Seattle Channel. It's called the WRAP Act, the Washington Recycling and Packaging Act, and it's a 140-page bill. This thing's a monster here, but the concept is this: make producers and shippers financially responsible for the packaging and waste they're creating. Countries do this around the world. They have for years. The idea has not caught on here in the U.S., but it does have some legs in Olympia this year with some bipartisan support. And I just wanted to bring up this idea here too, David, putting more of the onus on manufacturers to reduce packaging to start, and then be a better partner in terms of recycling it too. This is a part of the challenge. And I think what our state is trying to say is, you know what, these producers have to be part of the solution too.
Yeah, and that's an interesting approach. I didn't realize it was more popular in other countries. And Washington, of course, is a big, huge port entrance for, especially from Asia and Japan and things coming in both through Seattle and Tacoma. And so I think it's the biggest on the West Coast behind LA.
Right.
And so if they wanted to kind of put pressure on shippers or manufacturers, or they are in a position to do so. I imagine that there's some concern around what that means around business, because there always tends to be with this
higher regulation equals higher costs, etc. Sure. Yeah.
Right. Interesting time to be taking this on.
Yeah. No, it really is.
I don't know what the timing, why the legislature exactly felt like now was the right time to do this. It's like I said, I don't know a ton about kind of the thought behind this bill, but I'd be curious to know more about why now.
Yeah. It's been in the cooker for a couple years here, and it was called the Renew Act before, and they're trying to change it in a little way. And Liz Berry, the representative from the 36th district here in Seattle, is one of the champions of this. Very interesting legislation. I know I'm bringing up something very new and different here to you, David, but I appreciate you starting this conversation, because I think it is one that our state, our city is definitely going to be looking at, because when you see these recycling rates stall out as they have in Seattle, they're really stalling out all over the place. It's King County has this issue too. And so looking for new answers, looking for businesses to potentially be a partner, that's part of the whole situation here. And we'll see how that pans out in Olympia here. It looks like this bill is still alive, the WRAP Act. And so more details on that coming up, well, just in a matter of months as the session wraps up in April. All right, well, moving on, some more alarming news for school parents out there. We're talking about Seattle and possibly some other major districts closing down some schools and starting some layoffs. Destination Education coming up on Now Hear This. Seattle schools in a rough situation right now amidst declining enrollment. The school district is cutting jobs. Definitely talking about this. The Seattle Times reports 30 employees in the central office were told they might be laid off next school year. 38 more might be on the chopping block too. It's all tied to enrollment losses, as Superintendent Brent Jones explained to the Seattle Rotary a few weeks ago.
And it looks like all the demographic data shows that for the next 7 to 8 years, that enrollment's going down. And that's just not us. That's the region and nationally. And so We're trying to do what we can to preserve teaching and learning. We're trying to hold schools harmless as much as possible, but we're starting with central office, and we're going to do some reductions here, unfortunately, but that's what we need to do.
So, David, there are some conversations happening right now about possibly consolidating schools, combining some of the smaller ones with the larger campuses in our 106 school system here in Seattle. That wouldn't happen until 2024 at the earliest. But as the superintendent just said, the long-term budget is not looking great. It's possible the district could drop to 45,000 students 5 years from now, some of the projections say, or about 5,000 students less than they have at this moment. What do you make of what's happening to the SPS, this declining enrollment, these layoffs? This is a big concern for a lot of parents out there.
It is, and it's not Seattle specific. Bellevue,
Right.
It's also talking about consolidating some schools, and I really
Bellevue,
think this is a public school issue that we're going to see across the country. And it really, I don't cover these things super closely, but my sense is this really comes down to the pandemic, which is schools. I think in all of the kind of weighing of safe, trying to be safe versus, not cut people completely off, schools was always the most fraught because, of course, they wanted to slow the spread of the coronavirus, but also, children are not shown to be all that at risk from COVID. And so this has always been kind of the minefield here. And now I think a lot of those issues that people were concerned about are coming home to roost in some ways, which is that people pulled their kids out, signed up for private school, started homeschooling, and then just are not coming back at the same levels. Seattle too, I think I would imagine there's probably some things around affordability and where people can live that have something to do with that, as well as and so of course as fewer students enroll, that means less money for those schools, and less money for those schools means fewer staff, because it's not like a one, if your class has 30 people or 25 kids in it instead of 30 kids in it, you still got to run the whole class. You still have to have a teacher. It's not like you can it's not like there's a proportional decrease in overhead with each kid that leaves. So it's a tricky situation. I would think that it's maybe sort of maybe this would kind of rebound after a few years as a new crop of parents who didn't have to kind of, people like me who didn't have to kind of parent their children through the pandemic maybe quite as much.
It was rough. That was not fun.
Maybe it would kind of swing back up, but the projections right now they're not great.
No, and I just think about this going into the future, and just personally, folks, this was a situation that my family faced in 2008 when we were going through that recession. And at the time, our local elementary school, they sent out a note to everybody in the neighborhood saying, well, we might be closing next year, we might not. And I mean, imagine that as a parent first entering the system, it's like, what do we do now? So we had to make some decisions there that were really difficult at the time, as I recall. And I empathize with parents out there that are looking at this. And I think you're right, David, with regard to students that are coming into the system or not coming to the system. It's kind of amazing. A lot of the no-shows, if you want to call them that, are kindergartners who are not getting enrolled into the Seattle public school system. And I'm just trying to figure out what's happening right now with SPS. They are working on an enrollment campaign to bring students back to the district. And I'm just trying to figure out, what does that look like? What messages need to be going out there from SPS to the general public there about how their schools are achieving, or what they can, what message can they put out there that would get more kids in the seats? I think that's the big goal right now.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that. As you were saying that, I would imagine it's interesting about the kindergarten classes. And, I don't know this for sure. I would imagine though, that because a lot of young families who can live in Seattle, are going to be wealthier these days, because it's just, that's what it takes to live in Seattle. And so I wonder if just the kind of chaos at public schools over the last few years, they don't always get the best press. Some of these wealthier families are living in areas where maybe the public schools historically haven't looked as good on paper. And so I would imagine that some of these families just can afford to go to private schools or go to different places. So the kind of income income to enrollment correlation would be kind of interesting for me to learn more about too.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's a lot of moving parts with this one for sure. But I know that Dr. Brent Jones, who's had the permanent job as superintendent since 2021, has a good relationship with the school board, which is a rarity over the past couple of years. He actually got through a week-long labor strike at the start of the 2022 school year. It looks like that's evened out and calmed down a little bit. So we'll see where those relationships pan out in the months and years upcoming here, because there's a big job ahead. I wanted to talk about one more thing, David, that the council is looking at this week. The Land Use Committee looking at accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. These are those backyard cottages you hear about. Now we are seeing more of them in the city of Seattle. This report shows in 2019, the council passed some regulations to encourage more of this infill kind of density. That's what I was trying to say. And the numbers show permitting is going up. We had 280 ADUs in 2019. In 2022, that number is now 988. And what's interesting to me here, David, I was looking at some of these numbers here. A number of these units are being used as short-term rentals, those STRs, as they're sometimes called, things like Airbnb, etc. About 12% of them. So it's interesting to me to see the number of ADUs going up, but it's at least partially a short-term rental business boost, as much as it is a boost in longer-term rentals that would actually improve our overall housing situation. Some thoughts about ADUs and what they could bring to Seattle.
Yeah, the ADU thing, the permitting is up, but Seattle needs way more housing than what
Oh yeah,
1,000 ADUs or whatever was going to provide.
yeah,
So in the grand scheme of things, it's probably kind of a drop in the bucket. As far as the short-term rental equation, I don't see that necessarily as being a bad thing, because that if that demand is there for
right.
short-term rentals and people can make money off of it, you'd probably prefer somebody who's living in their house build a backyard ADU and rent that out, rather than buying an entire house off the market and using that for a short-term rental. So I don't know. It's kind of, I don't know how the supply and demand of all that works. Like,
Yeah.
if the supply is there, does the demand also go up, or is
Mhm.
the demand fixed, and therefore it's probably a good thing to be putting some more supply in of ADUs? I don't know
Yeah.
exactly. My hunch though is, if not these ADUs, those short-term rentals would show up somewhere else in the market,
Mhm.
regardless. And so if this is kind of taking pressure off of people from buying like things that would have been primary residences otherwise,
I see. And
and
turning them
converting
into,
them
yeah,
into
okay.
short-term
Mhm.
rentals, then this would, in fact, sort of in an indirect way, possibly help the housing crisis as well. I don't,
Okay.
all this is very theoretical, and I don't have any
Yep.
data behind it, but
No, no, no.
it
It's
is
it's
kind
it's
of an
it's
interesting,
good to bounce the ideas for sure. And
yeah,
and there's another piece of this. It's interesting to see some of these different new ADUs that are coming on the market. As it turns out, sometimes when there's new construction, a house is demolished, let's say, a new home is built, and an ADU is actually included with it to try to take advantage of some of these different regulations that Seattle has in place. But there's one other piece of this that I thought was a very interesting twist. A third of the ADUs permitted are on condo parcels, and I'm totally in the weeds here, but these condos, the units are owned individually. The condominium whole setup, it's formed by the state with some administration by the county. So the city's not completely involved with it. And I think it's going to be really interesting where to see the bulk of these ADUs are going to get built. Is it going to be in this kind of condo situation, generally in higher income neighborhoods, or is it going to be in lower income neighborhoods where they really actually do need this extra housing? This question of equity, it's a major part of every issue that we tackle here, David, but it certainly is a big issue with housing and where this infill development is happening.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, my hunch is it's probably not going to be as much in lower income neighborhoods, because
Yeah.
it costs a lot of money to build an
Oh,
ADU. I
yeah.
mean, they're not cheap. But so you have to have some cash up front. What
Yep.
it is cheaper than, though, is, I think probably a lot of these ADUs, would be my guess. Again, I don't know for sure. Um, I would imagine a lot of people in single family homes have kind of long-term plans for these. So maybe they're using them as short-term rentals now, or renting them out to a tenant now,
Sure.
but they imagine, maybe their kids are away and this is like a chance for them, because it's hard to move back to Seattle right now as a
Hmm.
young person, because it's so expensive. So maybe their kids move in, or as they
Hmm.
age, this is something that they can, have an in-home caregiver, so I think some of these
Sure.
ADUs, um, are probably going directly to the rental market, but I would imagine some of them too are sort of exist for long-term planning purposes, as a way, because of course, assisted living, that's its whole own animal.
Oh
That's
yeah.
really difficult too. So if you can put an ADU in and then maybe have a caregiver or something when you're older, that provides a level of security for people who are living in larger homes.
Yes, very true. Very true. Interesting points all here, David. And I like talking about hunches with you, my man. You've always got some good ones here. So appreciate you engaging on all of that. Well, coming up here, did King County's controversial decision to repeal its mandatory helmet law for cyclists lead to fewer people wearing helmets? The answer might surprise you. David's got the details on Transportation Talk. David, you wrote recently in the Seattle Times about King County's 2022 repeal of its mandatory helmet law for cyclists. And you'd think people would say, hey, great, I don't need to wear this thing. But that hasn't exactly been the case. What's going on?
No, I mean, King County's helmet use is still super high. 91% of people riding a personal bicycle were found to be wearing a helmet. Um, the total number is 85%, but that's really only because of
The
people who are
scooter
riding,
guys, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah.
rented, specifically rideshare, kind of rented scooters or rented
Hmm.
bikes. That those helmet numbers were super low before and after there was a helmet law. I don't think the law really had any bearing on that.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, that was the big question around repealing this law was, is it going to lead to less helmet use and therefore more injuries? The point that advocates, people kind of pushing for it, had made, which is, when this law, because when this law first went into effect, there did appear to be some impact on helmet use. It looked like it actually did drive more helmet use.
Okay.
But the since that was passed initially in 1993, the helmets have just become so much more a part of, it's like seatbelts. Seatbelts used to not be so
Right.
standard, and now
Yep.
very few people imagine not putting a seatbelt on, or cigarettes or
Yep.
something. These safety
Yeah.
things that have just shifted so dramatically over time. And I think helmets is one of those. It's just really very ingrained, I think, in people at this point that helmet use is a good thing. And so,
Yeah.
when you're repealing, I think what this data shows is by repealing that law, it's not like King County went in a time machine back to 1993 when helmets were just not that
Yeah.
popular to begin with.
Right.
It is still the world we live in now, and that's a world where the vast majority of people put on a helmet when they're riding.
Yeah, I know. I never wore one when I was a kid on a bike. Probably should have been killed a few times. I'm just going to say that out loud, but I
Yeah.
wear one all the time now on a bike. I make sure my kids wear them too. It's just, I think you're right. It is part of the culture. But I wanted to talk about this in a little bit of a broader sense about what this means long term, looking at some of these safety numbers, because I think that, and maybe hearkening back to some of the things we were talking about with Vision Zero, helmets are not a complete answer for safety when it comes to cyclists out there. And I think that that part of the discussion needs to continue, really, because this whole idea about safety, it's not just about helmets.
No, and I think that's the point that a lot of bike safety advocates make is, we support helmet use
Sure.
because it is the last. But they see it as kind of the last safety tool. If you need to be wearing a helmet, if your helmet is the thing that saves you, there are a lot of things that have failed leading up to that point, and that is, did you have a safe place to ride to begin with?
Mhm.
Were you interacting with cars in a way that, were there enough bikers on the road that,
Yeah.
you're kind of given more space, so, in part of this story, I was looking around. I didn't include this in the story, but I saw that helmet use in Amsterdam is 1%.
Oh, wow.
nobody
Okay.
nobody wears a helmet, and yet injuries there are very rare because
Huh.
the way that the city's built, it's built for safety. And so
Yeah.
if you live in that world, then you probably really don't need a helmet. We don't live in that world in Seattle, the way that the city is laid out. As somebody who commutes on his bike,
Mhm.
it's sort of an extreme sport at times going
Yeah.
through the city.
True.
And so I would never dream of not wearing a helmet because for that reason. I
Yeah.
have been to Amsterdam and I've ridden around and I was perfectly fine not wearing a helmet. I felt
Yeah.
totally safe.
Right.
So that's kind of the larger picture there, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, someday, David, we're going to take that Seattle News Views and Brews trip on the road, take it to Amsterdam, and make
Yeah,
sure
I would love
we
that.
get the full story on that. We need to wrap up here, David, and thank you once again for joining me here. I wanted to ask, not with the cycling here, but have you considered getting your mariner's license? Rough times in all senses of the phrase there when it comes to our Seattle ferry system. I know you use the ferry quite a bit. What's going on, man?
Yeah, I'm on leave now, the last part of my parental leave, so I haven't followed up on it. But
Yeah.
we did a story last week where they kind of had this triumphant announcement of declaring the Kingston Edmonds route to be fully restored, meaning 95% of the time there should be two boats running. And then over the weekend there were basically there was just one boat running all weekend.
Yeah.
Apparently, according to Axios that I read this morning, apparently there were a lot of people called out sick.
Yeah.
Which would do that, but that's kind of a frustrating setback after just literally days after the ferry system sort of made this announcement that that route is the Kingston Edmonds route is supposed to be two boats all the time now. So, I mean, and then beyond just Kingston Edmonds, it's bad news for the people of Sydney, British Columbia. That route is not coming back till they say 2030. Wouldn't surprise me if it never came back, honestly. And then, people living in Bremerton are going to have to wait another 6 months, could go longer before they get a second boat. So it's things are in theory improving, although this weekend kind of cast some doubt into that.
Agreed. Well, David, hang in there, my man, through any rough waters. And I know I'm going to be checking in with you over the next couple of weeks here, et cetera, while you're on leave. But have a good leave, my friend, and hang in there. And thank you always for interacting with me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Please do find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon too, folks. If you listen, show your support. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media as well. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.